Welcome back to the last episode of Season 3 of the Recharge Zone podcast. I'm your host, Brent Doty, joined with my co-host, Ann-Margaret. Hi, Ann-Margaret.
Hi.
Well, Ann-Margaret, it's been quite an eventful year on the podcast and the agency. Is that right?
Yes, I would agree. There's been a lot of things that we covered, a lot of things that happened in the year that obviously we're going to recap in this episode, but the topics we covered were pretty, varied, and I think I learned a lot, at least.
I definitely did, too. We had folks from all over the agency joining us, starting off with Roland, our general manager, came on talking about the next generation concept, kind of what EAA is transitioning to between now and the next generation, the next 20, 30 years.
Yes.
Kind of explore some of the concepts within our next generation initiatives, which is all geared towards aquifer sustainability from not just for the next few years, but for the next several generations, because that's, I think, where the value lies as we move forward. So around those two key pieces, those are the most visible pieces of our work right now, the Education Outreach Center and the Field Research Park. But there's a lot underlying all that, and it begins with the posturing of our science programs. So the science, we've said it for a long time, that science feeds our programming. But I think in a very tangible, real way, we're putting more meat on those bones as we move ahead, because now we're gearing all our science programming in an integrated way to where it feeds off of each other and has some significant meaning to where we want to get. And that's feeding the next generation ideology of we need to be an agency that does everything we can to ensure that this water resource does remain sustainable, not just for the present, but for a long term to come, because that's remains the primary water resource for this region. So that work is now more entrenched in our science programming and will continue to be. And it goes hand in hand with what we're looking at on a similar planning horizon, and that's with our habitat conservation plan.
We also had guests like Marcus Gary, one of our scientists, join us.
So I'm going to start with evapotranspiration because that is a compound word, so we can break it apart into evaporation, which most people are probably familiar with, and transpiration, which you may or may not be familiar with. So evaporation, that's water that's changing its state from the liquid state to the gas state. So if you have water sitting in your cup in the hot sun, all that water that goes up into the atmosphere is evaporation. So transpiration is similar, but this is a process in which water goes from the soils into the atmosphere through plants. And so the metabolic processes of plants take that water and they transpire it, and it comes out through their leaves as transpiration. And so evapotranspiration is the sum of those two fluxes of water going from the land surface up into the atmosphere. And it's powered by the energy of the sun, through both processes.
Matthew Rogers and Thomas were on here.
Yeah, so really I think when you're talking about soil health, really what you're talking about is the health of the soil biology or the soil microbiology. And this is the fungi and bacteria that lives in the soil. And what this biology does over time is it can break down organic matter that's on the top of the soil, like leaf litter, plant residues, all of these things. And over time they turn into stable forms of carbon in the soil that can help hold that moisture into the soil.
So overall, when you're studying infiltration, it's critical to understanding kind of the complete water balance, and that can be used for various things that we're interested in. One of those is, possibly estimating groundwater recharge through the Vados zone, and that's kind of the zone between the surface and the water table. Hydrologists use hydraulic conductivity and infiltration rates. That they use those values for modeling. Researchers use it to determine soil health.
Giselle was on here recently talking about water quality sampling.
So in the past, when I first started collecting samples, I would have to have a water quality sonde for pH and temperature. Then I would have another sonde for conductivity, and then another sonde for turbidity, and then another sonde for dissolved oxygen.
I didn't know that.
Yes.
Wow.
And then I had another one for the digital titrator. So I would go to a location and I would have to take all my water quality sondes with me to this one location. And then they all each had their own little probe and then their wire. So I had to be very careful of not stepping over them or tripping over them. So technology has really advanced because today I'm very happy to say that we have a multi-probe, meaning I have one water quality probe that has all of the field parameters that I'm recording. So pH, conductivity, dissolved oxygen, temperature, and the DO, they're all in one sonde. So all I have to do is just put that sonde in my flow chamber, connect it Bluetooth to my phone. Yes. It's so much easier now. And then luckily we have an app that also records my field parameters. So not only am I recording it on my field sheet, it also has a digital backup. So when I come back to the office and if for whatever reason I can't read my writing, I can always go back to my log and say, oh, well, the pH was 7.4 instead of what I wrote 7.35.
Oh yeah, so like quality assurance, quality control kind of stuff.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And we had our ACP folks, Scott Stormont, Melanie Howard, and Mark Enders talking all about what's going on in the habitat conservation world.
Yes, and they recently held those listen and learn for the public to kind of give their comment and public input on the incidental take permit renewal process, right?
Yes, and that was an interesting segment there.
Well, we have begun, we started in 2018, started working basically on the new potential permit, what we're calling the permit renewal process. Mm-hmm. Most likely this permit there won't be a brand new permit that would be applied for. It'd be some type of amended permit that would allow for the successful measures and the successful parts of the program to continue on. Mm-hmm. Any parts of the program that might need to be modified or amended, we can do that. And if there's any parts of the program that in the HCP that just don't make sense and they've either we've covered that issue and we've done a good job with it, or if there's just some parts that just don't fit, which happens, there's some conservation measures that just don't make sense, we would remove them. And so we started that process in 2018. We've done a lot of analysis on which type of approach we want to take, whether it was, do we want to renew the permit brand new or do we want to amend it? I think we've kind of landed on amending it in some fashion. And the idea is to seek a 30-year permit this time rather than a 15-year permit.
We also had Sarah Valdez talking about the EOC and everything happening there, the Education and Outreach Center.
That opened in April.
The Education Outreach Center is going to be using some of that data and some of that research and some of those scientists and really just kind of working as a community of learners. So they're not just going to be in their classrooms, but they're out here at this beautiful center and they're learning things that are happening right now. They're studying the aquifer right along with us, and so we're all learning together.
And we had Mark Freeberg talking about kind of the regulatory side. So a lot of times we talk about education and science, and we miss that aspect that the EAA is also a regulatory agency. So he was on here talking about that side of the house.
As we're moving forward as a regulatory entity, we have to look at the Edwards as both protecting its quantity and protecting its quality. So the Edwards has water quality regulations, mostly having to do with activities on our recharges, on the sensitive part of the aquifer.
So lots of interesting stuff. And then finally ending up with Brock Curry, who kind of came on here and as the last part of his career, which I thought was pretty awesome.
I think for me, it was don't get too comfortable with what you're doing because you're going to do something that you never dreamed of.
I like that.
And don't get too comfortable, but also don't worry about what the next step is.
Yes.
You have to have a little bit of be a little fearless.
Yeah.
I guess.
In addition to that, we had a board meeting recently, which was really important. It's one of Brock's last board meetings, but also it was Luana Buckner's last board meeting as chair of the EA board. And Luana has been on that board for decades.
I believe 26 years.
Yeah, since the inception of the EAA, she has been on there. And it was her last board meeting, and the board chair position was turned over to the interim chair, the vice chair, Enrique Valdivia at that time. So it was a big occasion at the board meeting. It was
so great to see. And we did, there was a round of applause and a standing ovation for all of her hard work, being the chair for all those years.
Yeah, I was glad that we had her on along with Carol Patterson in season 2 talking about their time in the board, because both of those folks had been there the entire time. So they went through the permitting, through the EAA's early years, and all the way into this next generation phase of the EAA.
Yes, that's great. And at the board meeting, we learned something interesting about the aquifer and the aquifer conditions. So at the Tuesday board meeting on December 13th, Paul Bertetti, your boss, Senior Director of Aquifer Science Research and Modeling, he talked about how this is at the San Antonio airport. This year they received 11.2 inches of rain, and that puts us at the second lowest on record. The second before we recently took the spot this year was in 1954, which he said was during the drought of record, which was 13.7 inches. So can you kind of
what he was talking about was the driest years in terms of total rainfall received at the San Antonio Airport rain gauge, which is kind of the longest standing, most recognized rain gauge in our system. It's been tracked since early days.
Wow.
So, those 2 other years, 1917 and 1954, were really dry as well. And we were kind of hovering at position 3, but I think we are still going to end up as the second driest year ever on record. Which speaks a lot to just how intense our drought was this year. Of course, there have been droughts of longer duration. You mentioned the 1950s. That was essentially a 10-year drought span. This has only been a 1-year drought, fortunately, but it was one of the most intense ever.
Wow. And, I mean, we kind of talked about this with Roland a little bit. And, I think it was the middle of the summer when we kind of declared that we were like in stage 4 and we were in a drought, right?
Yes. We went into stage 1 pretty quickly, and then pretty quickly into 2 and 3, and then sure enough, stage 4 by late summer, and that's when we had Roland on because, of course, the springs are still flowing. They're flowing right now. So we talked about the importance of our conservation measures of critical period, of cutting back permitting amounts during drought and why we do that. And I think it's super important, and that's why we had him on there.
Yes, and speaking of, I know something kind of chatter around our office was the fact that VSPO triggered, right?
That's right, the Voluntary Irrigation Suspension Program option. That's a lot of words.
Yeah.
But basically, it's when we subsidize certain volunteer irrigators to not irrigate during the driest years. And it only triggers if the aquifer meets certain drought conditions on a year-to-year basis. So it doesn't trigger very often, but it sure did this year.
Wow.
As we dropped below that level.
Yes, and that brings me back to during the board meeting, Paul was also mentioning that the J27 index well in Uvalde was below average for this time of year, and the Bayer J17 index well had increased a little bit this month, but was still about 30 feet below normal for this time of year. So we're like, even though he said we experienced normal rainfall, so we're still like at a deficit, right?
Most certainly. Now J27, although it's still in drought, they've actually fared a bit better in terms of total rainfall. Towards Del Rio is doing okay, and then towards Austin is okay. So unfortunately, there's this exceptional drought bubble right around the Springs area and Bexar County, which have made J27 in the Springs really low.
Wow.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, it really puts it into perspective. And then finding out that it's the second driest year since those records, like, that's pretty major.
Yeah, it didn't rain much all summer. We've kind of experienced, near averages now in November and December, which is good. It's hopeful for, maybe we'll have an average or above average spring, and that's really when we expect most of our rainfall to come in. So it'd be really nice to see that. Based on our current conditions, we're expected to still be in some kind of drought phases towards the beginning of the year, and conservation is still going to be key. And we're definitely going to have some guests on here to talk about things like permitting, like regulations, and how we protect the aquifer even during times like this.
And I know we recently held, a few of our staff members recently held some Q&A sessions out west to kind of help our permit holders, correct, right? Like they do those meetings to help meet with their permit holders out there where they live and, giving them the information they need. Yeah,
absolutely. Permit holders need to know how much water they're going to have access to, and it's kind of helping them with that. If we're going to be in stage 1, 2, 3, or 4, what does that mean for your permit? And how much water can you expect to have?
So kind of switching gears a little bit, I know this is something we talked about in our last episode, but I guess what are the plans for the Field Research Park in 2023? And I know y'all are like full steam ahead. The research is booming. Things are happening. What's next?
I'm glad you mentioned that because, we had, of course, Marcus on here talking about some things related to that with evapotranspiration, and with Matt and Taylor and Thomas talking about soil moisture and calculating that. So the research going on at the FRP is all about adding tools into our sustainability toolbox, if you will. It's about conservation. How can we manage the landscape in such a way to allow water to have a longer time to sink in and increase our recharge amounts? So our research is aimed at quantifying the benefits of land management. So this coming year, it's all about adding more sensors and data collection instruments to sort of help us quantify that.
Nice.
And also getting more people involved in that story and understanding it.
I know you all I know the number is kind of, out there floating, but you all had quite a few guests from all across the board, right? Even from out of the country, visit the FRP to learn about some of the practices.
Absolutely. There have been dozens of tours from agencies, entities, individuals, universities out there. You mentioned this group, international group from Saudi Arabia, visited the FRP. We've had agencies such as the Texas Water Development Board and TCEQ out there. USGS have been out there.
Nice.
So a lot of different folks coming to learn about what we're doing, kind of comment on it and take an interest in it.
Yeah,
and that's really neat.
And that brings me to, we shot a few videos about the drone surveying that you all did and the borehole drilling that you all did to feature them at the Education Outreach Center, because it's not, the FRP is obviously not open to the public, but we want to share the research y'all are doing in a way that everyone can understand it. So those videos will be featured at the Education Outreach Center in 2023. And just kind of going along with that, the Education Outreach Center finished its season out for 2022. We had a lot of schools, a lot of students visit, a lot of great people talking about what they've learned about the Edwards Aquifer, enjoying the exhibits, the interactive, nature of them. And I think overall we had a really good year. So it's currently closed right now, but the 2023 season for the EOC begins Wednesday, January 18th. And we actually are letting people schedule their visits now. So, anyone is welcome to come. It's free. It's open to all. It has some fun. So if you haven't been, it has some fun science interactive exhibits. We have a huge global perspective display. We currently have an aquarium with the Texas blind salamander and some fountain darters in a different aquarium. And those are endangered species. They're protected by the Edwards Aquifer Habitat Conservation Plan. We have a lot of great things, a demonstration garden, so people can kind of put their gloves on and learn about different ways that they can plant native plants in their gardens at home. So it's something for everyone, and like I said, it's free and open to the public. So people should schedule their visits, and we're opening the scheduling now, so people can go ahead and prepare for 2023.
That's awesome. Yeah, I've personally been and really enjoyed it, and then encourage you all to take a visit. And of course, Sort of behind all these scenes here is our other entity, the Edwards Aquifer Conservancy, which is our nonprofit arm. Is that right?
Yes, the EAC is something that supports efforts and projects from the EAA and the EOC and the FRP. And right now, the Conservancy, which is a nonprofit, is participating in the Champions for Charity Valero Texas Open to raise money to support the ongoing prospective work of the EAA. And it's carrying out these ongoing things to help the mission of managing, enhancing, and protecting the Edwards Aquifer. Champions for Charity is a no-cost program that gives 100% of the funds raised back to the participating organization, i.e., the EAC. And they also include an incentive, which is a 7% match. So we're currently trying to raise funds. Last year, the Conservancy raised about $4,000, and this year, Nikki has pledged to raise about $5,000 this year. She is our Senior Community Outreach and Development Administrator. She works alongside outreach programs for the EAA and helps with EAC nonprofit outreach as well. So that's something that we're currently doing, and you all can learn more or donate if you feel so inclined to do and become a rainmaker, changemaker, as Nikki would say. You can do that at eaconservancy.org.
Sounds good, Ann-Margaret. Well, so in summary, we're in a drought, unfortunately. We hope to get out of it, but in the meantime, we're going to manage the aquifer the best we can, and we want you all to understand how that happens and how we do it and why. So we had a lot of great guests last year. We're hoping for it. Same kind of lineup this coming year. Lots of great guests across the agency and maybe even some external folks. All right. Thanks, y'all, for listening to this month on the Recharge Zone podcast.
Happy holidays. Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Recharge Zone podcast. Have questions, ideas for topics, or things you would like to share with us? Well, reach out to us at rechargezone@edwardsaquifer.org.